Before Rome became the empire that shaped the world, it was just a dream, whispered by shepherds, carried by the wind along the Tiber River. You can almost picture it, the early morning fog rising from the hills of Latium, and two infants crying in the reeds. Their names? Romulus and Remus. The story begins not with marble or glory, but with survival. Legend says a she-wolf found them, abandoned and helpless. She nursed them beneath a fig tree, watched by a woodpecker, both sacred animals to Mars, the god of war. It's the kind of myth that feels larger than life, yet deeply human. Because before Rome built its empire, it built a story, one powerful enough to last for millennia. As the twins grew, they dreamed of a city that would rule the world. But even the greatest dreams begin with conflict. When the time came to decide who would rule their new city, Romulus and Remus turned against each other. A quarrel over omens, a handful of birds flying in the sky, ended in blood. Romulus struck down his brother and founded his city on the Palatine Hill. He named it after himself, Rome. From that moment, destiny seemed to move in lockstep with ambition. Romulus invited outcasts, wanderers, and fugitives to join him. A city for the unwanted became a force that no one could ignore. But every birth leaves scars. The early Romans had courage and cunning, yet their hunger for power often came with violence. Under Romulus, the young city grew, but it needed women to survive. The infamous rape of the Sabine women followed, a tragic story of desperation and politics. Rome took what it lacked, yet from this brutal act came a fragile peace. The Sabines and Romans united, and the city doubled in strength. It's a pattern we'll see again and again. War followed by unity, chaos followed by order. As generations passed, Rome was ruled by a line of 7 kings, each leaving a mark that shaped its destiny. There was Numa Pompilius, the peaceful priest king, who gave Rome its religion and rituals. Tullus Hostilius, the warrior who destroyed Alba Longa, reminding Rome that peace never lasts. Ancus Marcius, the builder who expanded Rome's borders and founded its first port at Ostia, a hint of the empire to come. And then came the Etruscan kings, foreign rulers who transformed Rome from a cluster of huts into a real city. They brought art, architecture, and ambition. The great sewers, the Cloaca Maxima, drained the marshes. The Forum began to take shape. The people wore togas and built temples to Jupiter. Rome was becoming something big. But power borrowed is never safe for long. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled like a tyrant. He silenced the Senate, crushed his enemies, and ruled through fear. His downfall came not from armies, but from outrage. His son's crime against a noblewoman, Lucretia, sparked a revolution. Her tragic suicide became a cry for freedom. In 509 BCE, the Romans did something almost unthinkable for their time. They overthrew their monarchy. The kings were gone. In their place, the people established a new system, one that would define the next 5 centuries, the Roman Republic. From myth to revolution, Rome's story had begun its transformation. The wolf's children had grown into a civilization that refused to bow to any one man again. And yet, beneath the marble and ceremony, a question lingered. Could a city born from violence ever truly live in peace? Rome had shed its kings like a snake discards its skin. But freedom isn't as simple as killing a tyrant. What came next wasn't peace. It was an experiment, one that would stretch across centuries, shaping how the world thought about power. The Romans called their new system res publica, literally, the public affair. No kings, no crowns, just citizens and councils, laws and debates. On paper, it sounded like balance. In reality, it was a constant tug of war between two classes: the patricians, the wealthy elite who claimed descent from the city's founders, and the plebeians, the everyday citizens, farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, who carried the republic on their backs. At first, only the patricians had real power. They filled the Senate, passed the laws, commanded the armies. The plebeians? They bled for Rome, but had no say in how it was ruled. That didn't last. Rome's people had tasted freedom and refused to be silent. Through strikes, protests, and sheer stubbornness, the plebeians forced the creation of new rights and new voices. They got their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, who could veto unfair laws. Over time, this uneasy partnership formed the foundation of the Roman Republic. But even as the Republic learned to govern itself, it learned something more dangerous: how to expand. The hills of Latium weren't enough. Rome began to spread, first to neighboring towns, then across all of Italy. Every war, every alliance, every treaty seemed to pull the city further into the web of conquest. The Samnite Wars, brutal and relentless, taught Rome the cost of ambition. The Latin Wars reminded it that allies could become enemies overnight. Yet with every victory, Rome adapted. Defeated enemies weren't always destroyed. They were often absorbed. Soldiers from conquered cities became Roman soldiers. Cultures mixed. Roads stretched like veins through Italy, carrying goods, ideas, and control. Rome didn't just fight wars, it learned from them. From the Greeks, it borrowed architecture and philosophy. From the Etruscans, their engineering and rituals. From its enemies, it took tactics and refined them. Each battle was a lesson, each piece a strategy. And with this expansion came wealth. Spoils, slaves, gold. They poured into the city. The Republic grew stronger and hungrier. Power became addictive. Senators debated conquest as if it were a sport. Generals began to dream not of service, but of glory. And ordinary citizens, tired of endless wars, began to ask who was really benefiting. The cracks were forming, small, almost invisible at first, but history always whispers before it shouts. Still, Rome's confidence was unshakable. Its legions were unmatched, its roads unmatched, its laws unmatched. The Republic believed it was destined to rule. And destiny, as we know, is the most dangerous kind of belief. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome stood on the brink of something far greater and far deadlier. Across the sea waited a rival city that mirrored Rome's ambition and mastery: Carthage. A clash between them wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. As the Senate argued and soldiers prepared, no one could have imagined that this rivalry would define the next 100 years and decide which civilization would rule the Mediterranean. Across the glittering blue of the central Mediterranean stood two cities with the same heartbeat: trade, power, pride. On one shore, Rome, new to overseas ambition, iron-willed and disciplined. On the other, Carthage, ancient, wealthy, master of the sea. They didn't just compete, they collided. It started over Sicily in 264 BCE, a rocky stepping stone between Italy and Africa. Small mercenary disputes spiraled into something larger, the way brush fire becomes a wall of flame when the wind shifts. Rome had never fought a long naval war. Carthage practically breathed salt air. But if Rome lacked ships, it didn't lack solutions. Carthaginian wrecks were copied plank for plank. A strange boarding bridge, the Corvus, a spiked gangway. turned sea battles into infantry fights, Rome's specialty. Imagine the shock on Carthaginian decks as the Romans slammed those bridges down, locked hulls together, and fought as if the ocean were a field outside the city walls. The First Punic War dragged on for more than 20 years. Fleets were sunk by storms and by each other, treasuries emptied, soldiers aged in armor. Finally, in 241 BCE, Rome forced peace. Carthage surrendered Sicily, the first Roman province. Sardinia and Corsica followed in the aftermath. Carthage still had money and ships, but the balance had shifted, and Rome felt the new heft of empire on its shoulders. Provinces meant governors, taxes, supply lines, administration that would knit the Mediterranean together like a network of nerves. Yet peace didn't cure resentment. It covered it like plaster over a fractured wall. To the west, Carthage rebuilt its fortunes in Iberia under the Barcid family, Hamilcar, then Hasdrubal, and finally, a young commander whose name would haunt Roman sleep, Hannibal. As a child, legend says, he swore eternal hatred for Rome. As a general, he made that oath a plan. In 218 BCE, Hannibal did the impossible. He marched an army, infantry, cavalry, and war elephants over the Alps in winter. Picture it like a slow-motion nightmare. Men sliding across ice-slick ledges, hooves striking sparks on rock, trumpets echoing against snow. Many died. Enough survived. And in northern Italy, those survivors began breaking Rome's pride piece by piece. Trebia, Lake Trasimene, then Cannae, 216 BCE, the dark star in Rome's sky. Hannibal let the Roman center press forward, then closed a crescent of cavalry and infantry around them, an annihilating embrace. Tens of thousands of Romans fell in a single day. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a surgical dismantling of Roman confidence. Allies wavered. The Senate trembled. Some whispered that Rome itself would fall, but Rome did not break. It changed its breathing. Instead of chasing Hannibal into traps, it bled him by refusing the perfect battle. The Fabian strategy, named after Quintus Fabius Maximus, favored delay, harassment, denial of supplies. It was patience with a blade tucked inside. While Hannibal prowled Italy seeking a decisive win, Rome opened another door. That door led through Spain and then across to Africa with a bold young general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus. Where others saw Hannibal's shadow, Scipio saw Carthage's heartbeat. Cut the arteries in Spain, then strike the heart in Africa. He studied his enemy, borrowed tactics from Iberian warriors, trained flexible formations, and turned Roman discipline into artistry. In 202 BCE, at Zama, Scipio met Hannibal at last. The Carthaginian elephants charged first. Roman lines opened corridors, so the beasts thundered through to nowhere. The cavalry, Numidian allies under Massinissa, tipped the balance. When the dust settled, Carthage sued for peace. Indemnities, hostages, no war without Rome's permission. The Second Great War ended not with a massacre of civilians or the salting of fields, but with something colder: control. Rome emerged changed. Its legions had marched from Spain to Africa. Its diplomats cut deals across seas and mountain chains. Money poured into Italy: war booty, slaves, trade profits. Villas expanded into latifundia, vast estates worked by enslaved labor. The city buzzed with Greek tutors, Eastern luxuries, new gods, new tastes. The Republic was still the Republic, but the habits of empire were setting like concrete. For Carthage, the peace felt like a choke collar. It paid debts, rebuilt quietly, turned to commerce. In Rome, though, old grudges had long memories. Cato the Elder, an unbending senator, ended his speeches with the same refrain: Carthage must be destroyed. You can almost hear the chambers rustle, the murmur, the nods, the tightening of a narrative that wanted a final act. The Third Punic War, 149-146 BCE, was shorter, crueler, and less glorious than the rest. Carthage, harassed by Numidian raids, yet forbidden by treaty to defend itself, finally pushed back and gave Rome its excuse. The siege lasted for years. Stone by stone, street by street, the Romans closed a fist around a city that had once owned the waves. Flames climbed into the sky. When it ended in 146 BCE, Carthage was gone, its citizens dead or enslaved, its ground leveled. On that same year, Corinth and Greece fell too, a sign that Rome was now rewriting the map of the Mediterranean in ink and ash. Victory, however, carries fine print. The wealth of conquest concentrated in fewer hands. Small Italian farmers, away on long campaigns, returned to find their plots ruined or absorbed by neighbors with deeper purses. The influx of slaves undercut free labor. City streets, crowded with citizens who had fought for Rome and now couldn't find a place inside it. The Senate wrangled over policy like a family squabbling over an inheritance. Rome had beaten its greatest external rival and set the stage for internal storms. Abroad, the Mediterranean shifted on its axis. Macedonian kings had tested Rome and lost. Greece's artistry and thought now poured into Roman culture, even as Roman rule pressed down. Eastern kingdoms learned to balance diplomacy and tribute with the iron fact of legions. Roads grew longer, taxes more intricate, the administrative machinery humming. The world was becoming Roman not only by force, but by familiarity. Law codes, coinage, calendars, and the idea that order radiated from a city beside the Tiber. And yet, beneath triumph's trumpet, a quieter sound, tension, tightening strings. Ambitious generals saw pathways from loyal service to personal power. Voters learned the taste of grain doles and spectacle. Political campaigns sharpened, voices grew harsher, and the old ideals of shared sacrifice strained against the new realities of wealth and widening inequality. When historians call the Punic Wars a turning point, this is what they mean. Rome didn't simply win territory, it won habits, standing armies far from home, tax farming, provincial governance, all the complexities that test a republic's soul. The Roman story from here on isn't only about battles. It's about what power does to the people who hold it and to the laws that are supposed to hold them. In the ashes of Carthage, you can see the outlines of future names: the Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar. Men who would inherit a state stretched to its limits and decide whether to shore it up or split it open. Some would try reform, others would choose the sword. For now, picture Rome on a summer afternoon, a few years after the last flames in Africa burned out. The forum thrums with cellars and orators. Senators wind their togas tighter against the dust. In a side street, a veteran with scarred arms haggles over bread, his reputation worth less than the coins in his palm. Up on a hill, a new villa expands, its courtyard ringed with Greek statues. A city at its height and at its most fragile. What destroyed Carthage wasn't just Roman steel. It was Roman certainty. The belief that Rome's destiny was to rule. That certainty would lift the Republic to new peaks and lead it to the cliff's edge. Victory filled Rome's granaries, but it didn't fill its promises. Farmers came home to ruined fields. The rich grew richer, buying up land and hiring enslaved labor. The streets got louder. And into that noise stepped two brothers with a simple, dangerous question. What if Rome remembered the people who built it? The Gracchi were not radicals from the margins. They were insiders, grandsons of Scipio Africanus, who believed the Republic could be saved by fairness. Tiberius Gracchus proposed giving public land back to poor citizens so they could farm again and stand as self-sufficient soldiers. Tradition fought back. In a city that praised debate, clubs and benches suddenly mattered more than words. Tiberius was beaten to death near the Temple of Jupiter, his body tossed into the Tiber like a problem the city couldn't face. His younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, tried again. Grain at fair prices, new courts to check corruption. Citizenship expanded to allies who fought and bled beside Romans. For a moment, the city tilted toward reform. Then the balance snapped back. Violence rose like a tide. Gaius died on a hillside, another warning that ideals without allies become targets. The Republic learned a new habit. When laws fail, people turn to fists. Out on the frontiers, the army was changing too. Soldiers used to be landowners who went home after the campaign. Now, with land scarce and campaigns longer, Gaius Marius opened enlistment to the poor. He gave them equipment, training, and, most importantly, hope. Their loyalty shifted from the Senate to the commander who paid them and promised land. Marius crushed foreign threats like the Cimbri and Teutones, and for a heartbeat, he looked like the answer. But power in Rome is never alone. It always walks with a rival. That rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, sharp, proud, and unafraid to break the rules if the rules got in his way. When command of a rich Eastern war swung from Sulla to Marius, Sulla did what no Roman general had dared. He marched his legions on Rome itself, shields glinting in the city's streets. That was a line the Republic had never crossed. Once crossed, it never forgot the path. The tug of war became civil war. Marius seized control, then died. Sulla returned and took revenge. Lists, prescriptions went up in public. Names on a board meant death, and the killer got a reward. Senators were murdered, fortunes seized, fear made into policy. Sulla called it a restoration of the Republic. It looked like a rehearsal for something darker, a state that could be ruled by a single will if that will had enough soldiers. Even as Rome hurt itself, the world pressed in. Spartacus, a gladiator, led an army of enslaved people that roamed Italy for 2 years, beating real legions and exposing how brittle order could be. The revolt was finally crushed by Crassus, the richest man in Rome, with Pompey finishing the remnants and taking a generous share of the credit. Fame stuck to Pompey like sunlight. Abroad, Rome fought Mithridates of Pontus, a king who hated Roman arrogance and had the cunning to match it. Victories stretched Rome's reach into Greece and Asia Minor, bringing wealth and new thinking home. Pompey the Great swept the seas of pirates, then reorganized the East, sketching provinces and client kingdoms as if he were redrawing a map for a game he intended to win. Back in the city, another voice sharpened the air. Cicero, the orator who killed conspiracies with paragraphs. He exposed Catiline, a desperate aristocrat who planned to burn the city to reset the board. Catiline died sword in hand. Cicero saved the day, then learned that saving the day doesn't mean steering tomorrow. Tomorrow belonged to a triangle. Pompey, glory. Crassus, money. And a rising politician with relentless charm and a calculating smile, Julius Caesar. Together, they formed an understanding, later called the First Triumvirate. It wasn't a law. It was a handshake that bent laws to its will. Pompey wanted his settlements approved. Crassus wanted lucrative tax contracts secured. Caesar wanted a command big enough to turn his name into legend. He got it. Gaul. For nearly a decade, Caesar campaigned through forests and rivers, pushing Roman rule to the Atlantic and even crossing into Britain. Dispatches read like adventure stories. Bridges built in days. Winter marches through snow. Alliances spun like thread. The Senate watched the fame meter climb and pretended not to hear the ticking behind it. When the alliance cracked, Crassus killed in Parthia, Pompey drifting back to the Senate, Caesar's term ended with orders to return to Rome as a private citizen, stripped of his army and its protections. He stood at the Rubicon, a narrow river that had become a moral ocean. Cross it with troops, and you declare war on the state. He crossed. The die is cast, he said, and the Republic rolled with it. Civil war ripped through the Mediterranean. Pompey, once unstoppable, lost ground, then lost everything at Pharsalus. He fled to Egypt and met a quiet knife on a quiet shore. Caesar arrived to find a court playing its own game, sibling rulers, Ptolemy the Firthurian and Cleopatra VII. Caesar chose Cleopatra, and after a palace siege among burning papyrus rolls, set her back on the throne. Politics and romance braided together. A son, Caesarion, soon followed, a human symbol of a partnership that made the Senate sweat. Back in Rome, Caesar moved like a man trying to fix a ship while it sailed. Calendar reform? Hello, July. Debt relief. Colonies for veterans. Expansion of citizenship. A larger Senate to weaken old cliques. He took the title dictator. First temporary, then longer, then effectively for life. The line between stabilizer and monarch blurred. Crowns appeared in festivals and were refused in public, carefully, theatrically. But the message felt less like no, and more like not yet. Some saw a savior who could silence chaos. Others saw the end of the thing they'd sworn to defend. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius surrounded Caesar in the theater of Pompey. Blades flashed. A great man fell at the base of a statue of Rome's past greatness. The killers cried, "Liberty!" The city answered with fear. You'd think removing the strong man would restore the old balance. Instead, the floor gave way. Mark Antony, Caesar's right hand, roused the crowd with a funeral oration that turned grief into rage. Gaius Octavius, Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old heir, claimed the name Caesar and began the most patient, careful climb in Roman history. Brutus and Cassius raised armies for the Republic, but ideals need legions, and the legions followed the living men who promised victory and pay. At Philippi, Antony and Octavian crushed the liberators. The world was divided. Antony took the east. Octavian took the west. A deal on paper, a duel in waiting. Antony bound himself to Cleopatra, speaking the language of kings in Alexandria, while Octavian spoke the language of duty in Rome. Letters and propaganda did the early cutting. Then came ships. At Actium in 31 BCE, wind and wildfire decided fates. Antony and Cleopatra fled. Their alliance unraveled. Within a year, both were dead in Alexandria, and the Ptolemaic kingdom folded into Rome like the final piece of a puzzle that had taken centuries to assemble. Octavian stood alone, not a king, never that, but something new that felt like a softer word for the same shape. The Republic, as a system of balanced ambitions, had torn itself open. What rose from the tear would look peaceful, golden even for a while. But tonight, in our story, let it be a quiet image. The Tiber at dusk, the Forum cooling, a young victor walking past the ruins of older certainties with an expression that says he will take the world and make it calm by holding it still. Power can arrive like thunder, or it can arrive like a whisper that never stops. Octavian chose the whisper. After years of civil war, he stepped into the Senate in 27 BCE and gave back the state. The gesture wasn't surrender, it was theater. In return, he received new honors, new provinces, and a new name with ancient weight: Augustus, the revered one. Not king, never king, just princeps, the first citizen, the man who stood in front so everyone else could pretend they stood beside him. What made it work wasn't just titles. It was auctoritas, moral authority, the gravity of a life that looks inevitable. He held the consulship when useful, tribunician power for the people's voice, proconsular power over key legions. On paper, the republic lived. In practice, a single mind smoothed the traffic of the world's biggest city. Augustus understood Rome's exhaustion, so he offered the one luxury that conquers all others: calm. He trimmed the Senate, codified its procedures, and created an administrative spine for an empire: procurators for finances, prefects for the grain supply, the Praetorian Guard to guard the city and him. He reorganized the legions into a professional standing army with fixed terms and permanent bases along the frontiers, plus a aerarium militare, a military treasury to pay veterans. Loyalty no longer moved with a general's charisma. It settled into the salary line. Peace needs pageantry. Augustus rebuilt the city with a careful eye for symbolism. Temples renovated, aqueducts strengthened, marble replacing brick. The boast would live on his lips and on the res gestae. I found Rome a city of brick. I left it a city of marble. The Ara Pacis, an altar to peace, carried a subtler message in its vines and processions: family, fertility, order, a world that breathes in rhythm. In the Forum of Augustus, statues of old heroes lined the porticos, as if to say the past approved this present. But peace isn't just monuments. It's bread on tables and water in cisterns. The grain dole stabilized the poor. Fire brigades and night watchmen trimmed the city's chaos. Roads, milestones, and way stations stitched provinces to capital. The ius cursus publicus, the imperial post, carried orders and news faster than rumor could run. Governors were held to account, more or less. Tax farming was curbed. Law became a net that caught more than it missed. Belief matters too. Augustus styled himself Pontifex Maximus, high priest, steward of the gods' goodwill. Moral legislation pushed traditional virtues, marriage, children, fidelity, onto a society that liked its pleasures. Hypocrisy? Of course. But law can be theater with consequences, and the message soaked in. Rome would be strong because Roman families were strong, Roman rituals unbroken. He wasn't just emperor. He was the empire's conscience, or at least its narrator. Empire breathes through borders. In the west, legions pushed into Spain, subdued the Cantabrians, and drew steady silver from the mountains. In the Alps, passes were secured, tying Italy to Gaul like laces pulled tight. In the east, Augustus preferred client kings and negotiation to endless campaigns. Parthia returned captured Roman standards lost by Crassus decades earlier, not by battle, but by leverage and ceremony. A golden moral. Some victories are cheaper when bought, but the map never sits still. In Germania, 3 legions under Varus marched into a forest and never marched out. Teutoburg, 9 CE. An ambush, rain, mud, trees too close together for discipline to breathe. The eagle standards fell into barbarian hands. The shock rippled through marble halls. Augustus reportedly tore his hair and cried, "Quinctilius Verus, give me back my legions." Borders mattered because beyond them, the world did not care about the Roman story. After Teutoburg, Rome blinked and chose the Rhine as a line to keep, not a line to cross again in force. Ambition learned a cautious step. The emperor's house was the state's heartbeat, and succession was its arrhythmia. Augustus needed heirs who could inherit not just power, but the performance of power. Marcellus, the bright nephew, died too young. Agrippa, the indispensable friend and general, married into the family and then died as well. The next hopes were the young princes Gaius and Lucius, raised for the purple, celebrated in sculpture and ceremony, gone before their time, each death tightening the city's throat. In the end, the pragmatic choice, Tiberius, capable, distant, already a proven commander. Family became politics. Politics became family. Rome learned to watch a household as closely as a frontier. While the palace managed dynasties, the streets learned a new rhythm. Poets and historians found their voices in a Rome that had finally stopped shouting. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, giving the empire an origin myth stitched to Homer, Aeneas carrying a father on his back, destiny walking beside him. Horace polished balance and measure into odes. Livy breathed life into Rome's early legends, turning stories into a mirror for civic virtue. Art became a partner to policy, the pen laying a floor for the sword to march on. And ordinary days got safer. Markets opened without wondering if tomorrow would bring barricades. Veterans received colonies instead of promises. A merchant in Lugdunum could ship amphorae to Alexandria under the same laws, the same coinage, the same expectations of redress if cheated. This was the Pax Romana, not just as an absence of war, but as a presence of predictability, of standards, of time that flowed rather than fractured. Augustus aged into his legend. He traveled, inspected, adjusted, preferred compromise when it saved blood, firmness when it saved the system. He allowed honors, but trimmed excess. Statues rose without crowns. Laurel wreaths lay lightly. If it sometimes looked like modesty a spectacle, that was the point. The performance kept the peace. In 14 CE, at Nola, Augustus died. His body returned to Rome, his will read, his res gestae set in bronze. An audit of a life turned into a blueprint. The Senate declared him a god. The people had long since given him something stranger, the feeling that stability itself had a face. He left behind institutions that could run without him, and habits that would outlive them all. The idea that the empire is not just conquered land, but managed time. A way of making days ordinary again after centuries of extraordinary pain. He had smothered civil war with administration, and if some freedoms thinned in the process, most lives grew thicker with certainty. Picture the city at dusk after his funeral, the Tiber moving like a thought, the Ara Pacis pale and steady, the streets lit by oil lamps and routine. The world had learned a new word for power, one that smiled while it planned. And behind that smile, the machine hummed. Next comes the glow that makes textbooks sigh. The high tide of the Pax Romana. Emperors who built libraries and walls. Jurists who tamed disputes with precedent. Traders who stitched provinces together with sales and receipts. But golden ages cast long shadows, and somewhere in those shadows, cracks begin. Calm doesn't mean quiet. It means a rhythm you can trust. After Augustus, Rome learned that rhythm. The empire breathed in long, steady measures, and for a century, the world felt as if someone had turned down the volume on chaos. Tiberius took the first watch, capable, withdrawn, preferring caution to glory. He kept the machine humming, even if the city yawned at prudence. Then came the flare and crash of Caligula, a reminder that peace can wobble when the man at the top mistakes the stage for a mirror. Claudius, unexpected, scholarly, stepped in with a clerk's mind and a general's backbone, adding Britannia to the map and strengthening the bureaucracy that would outlast his statue. Nero followed, all fire and theater, literally, in 64 CE, when flames devoured neighborhoods and left a char of rumor in their wake. He built the Domus Aurea, a palace of gold that glowed like a story you couldn't afford to believe. Rome survived emperors because Rome had systems. When the year of the four emperors, 69 CE, spun the throne like a coin, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, legions chose, cities waited, and the state reset. With Vespasian and the Flavians, the city found its footing again. He taxed cleverly. Yes, money has a smell. Success. You can almost hear him quip. And began the project that would become the postcard of Rome, the Colosseum. Titus opened it with games that leaned into spectacle while he shouldered disasters. Vesuvius erupting over Pompeii and Herculaneum, a fire, a plague. Domitian tightened discipline, loved order, feared shadows. The Senate hated him for it. Stability is sometimes a room you lock from the inside. Then the light broadened. With Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, a sequence scholars later called the Five Good Emperors, the empire hit a kind of stride that felt like destiny behaving. Trajan pushed the frontiers to their widest. Dacia conquered, its gold fueling architecture that still steals breath. Trajan's Forum, the markets, the column with its spiral of victories carved like memory into stone. Trade thickened. From Londinium to Antioch, from the Rhine to the Nile, caravans and ships carrying glass, wine, spices, silk, ideas. Hadrian pulled the borders tight, choosing depth over sprawl. He walked the empire, inspecting forts, sketching cities, improving laws, then drew a line across northern Britain. Hadrian's Wall, stone and turf saying, "Here we end, here we endure." He rebuilt the Pantheon, a dome so calm and impossible you feel it before you measure it. Its open eye to the sky, oculus, makes the building breathe with the weather, as if Rome had learned to keep time with the sun. Inside the empire, life got ordinary in the best way. Roads were smooth, milestones regular, way stations predictable. The cursus publicus carried letters like arteries carry blood. Coins, denarii, aurae, told stories of emperors and victories, and more importantly, bought bread with confidence. Roman law matured into a language that handled disputes without swords, thanks to jurists who treated fairness as a craft. Cities competed in urgetism, local elites sponsoring baths, theaters, fountains, because prestige tastes sweetest when others can drink it. Religion layered, as it always does. Old gods anchored ritual. New cults offered intimacy and promise. From Mithras and smoky underground shrines to Isis and processions bright with symbols, people tested pathways to meaning. In Judea, tensions with Roman rule erupted into war, 66-73 CE. The siege of Jerusalem ended with Titus carrying the menorah in triumph, its arch still catching the afternoon light on the Via Sacra. Later, under Hadrian, another blaze, Bar Kokhba's revolt, 132-135, ended in ruin and reshaping. Empire brings roads and rules. It also brings weight. The city itself became a theater of permanence. Aqueducts strode across valleys. Aqua Claudia, Annio Novus, delivering water so dependable that baths turned into social hours and health into habit. Baths of Trajan, later Caracalla, and Diocletian in centuries to come taught Romans the art of being public. Steam rooms, libraries, gardens, exercise for the body, release for the mind. In forums, advocates traded arguments. On steps, philosophers traded epigrams. Pliny the Younger wrote letters that sound like neighbors. Juvenal skewered pretension with a smirk. Galen squared anatomy with observation. The empire didn't just conquer space, it organized time. Market days, court terms, festival calendars, so most people could live by schedules instead of alarms. Of course, golden ages still get weather. Under Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who wrote to himself about virtue between campaigns, a new enemy rode in waves. Pressure on the Danube frontiers, and a plague, likely smallpox, that crept along trade routes and dimmed lamps across provinces. Markets thinned, legions weakened, and grief grew common enough to have a routine. Marcus kept writing, kept fighting, kept choosing duty over despair. When he died in 180, the metaphor many historians use is easy to feel. The hinge creaked. The door didn't slam, but it didn't close cleanly again. Commodus, his son, inherited a stable room and shook the furniture. He fancied himself Hercules, fought in the arena, renamed months, and let favorites run the ledgers. The Praetorian Guard, those supposed guardians of calm, discovered how profitable politics could be. Palaces turned into marketplaces of influence. Assassinations resumed their old, ugly efficiency. The mood shifted. Not collapse. Not yet. But the kind of fatigue you notice when a great building starts to groan in the wind. Even then, the ordinary miracle continued. Letters arrived. Contracts were honored. Ovens warmed in the morning. That's the secret of the Pax Romana. It endured not because emperors were perfect, but because the infrastructure of normal life got strong enough to survive them. Bridges held. Courts functioned. Local councils argued about aqueduct maintenance instead of rebellion. A farmer in Gaul knew whom to bribe if he had to. A sailor in Alexandria knew when the winds usually turned. If you stood on the steps of the Pantheon at sunset in the mid-2nd century, Rome would feel eternal. The air would smell of oil and stone, bread and bronze. Men in togas and women in bright-dyed stolas would move like they belonged to a script that couldn't be rewritten. The empire's promise, order, had become believable. And yet, every system carries the seeds of its own stress. A professional army is loyal, but it's expensive. Prosperity increases population. More mouths need more grain, more ships, more logistics, more luck. Provincial taxes must be gathered fairly enough to avoid revolt and firmly enough to pay the frontier. Succession remains a riddle you only get one shot to solve each generation. Somewhere in those ledgers, lines began to wobble. The next act won't open with a bang. It will open with pressure, on borders, in budgets, within barracks. Emperors will multiply, coinage will thin, and the idea of Rome will be tested in a storm that lasts half a century. For now, hold the image of a dome with a hole to the sky, letting rain fall in a perfect circle onto an immaculate floor. That circle is Rome's promise in this age, to take what comes from above, light or water, and turn it into order without panic. The promise will be kept until it isn't. Golden ages don't shatter in a single strike. They hairline first. After Marcus Aurelius, the seams in Rome's certainty began to creak. Commodus had already taught the city how fragile good routines were. When he died at the turn of 192 to 193, the throne became a revolving door. Pertinax tried to be a stern schoolmaster and lasted weeks. Didius Julianus literally bought the empire from the Praetorian Guard and found that buying loyalty is like renting a storm. It ends when the money does. Out of the chaos walked Septimius Severus, a general from Africa with gravel in his voice and a talent for making legions feel seen. He beat rivals, trimmed enemies, and told his sons on his deathbed, enrich the soldiers and scorn the rest. That sentence was a diagnosis and a prescription. The empire would survive on soldier pay and suffer from everything that followed. The Severan house mixed pragmatism with theater. Caracalla granted Roman citizenship widely in 212, the Constitutio Antoniniana, a gesture that made the empire feel unified on paper and conveniently broadened the tax base. He also raised soldiers' pay and swung a big sword at dissent. After him came Macrinus, brief, Elagabalus, scandalous, and Severus Alexander, earnest. Styles varied. The pressure did not. Beyond the frontiers, new forces tested the Roman line. In the east, Parthia fell and a hungrier state rose. The Sasanian Empire under Ardashir III, then Shapurabir, kings who dreamed in architecture and siege towers. On the Rhine and Danube, tribes, Goths, Alemanni, Franks, coalesced from looser confederations, stronger, faster, more coordinated than Rome preferred. In 235, soldiers murdered Severus Alexander on campaign. The lights flickered. For nearly 50 years, the empire spun through barracks emperors, generals lifted on shields by their troops, crowned by necessity, replaced by the next necessity. Some were brave and capable. Many were placeholders with coin faces. The rhythm became invasion, usurpation, plague, revolt, repair, repeat. Economies hate uncertainty, so does coinage. To pay troops and emergencies, emperors debased the silver denarius until it was mostly a rumor of silver. Confidence eroded with the shine. Prices rose. Merchants hoarded. Taxes in kind replaced taxes in cash in places where cash felt like a joke. The empire adapted, but every adaptation left a bruise. The frontiers burned and bled. In 251, at Abritus, the Goths killed the emperor Decius. First time a reigning Roman emperor died in battle against foreign enemies. Along trade routes, a new disease, the plague of Cyprian, tore through cities and camps for years, unspooling manpower and morale alike. Town councils struggled to keep aqueducts intact, recruit for legions, fill granaries, and bury the dead without bankrupting themselves. Some cities shrank behind smaller walls. Others emptied out, waiting for a normal that didn't return. Meanwhile, in the east, Shapur I hit hard. In 260, he captured Valerian alive at Edessa. An emperor turned hostage, a nightmare Rome had never seen. Legend says Shapur used Valerian as a human footstool to mount his horse. The truth matters less than the humiliation people believed. That same year, the empire felt like a dish that had cracked and split. In Gaul and Britain and parts of Hispania, a Gallic empire stood up under Postumus. In the east, Palmyra, a desert trading city under the sharp-eyed regency of Queen Zenobia, took responsibility for order against Persia, and then for more than order, stretching its power across Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. Rome still sat in Rome, but the map now had arguments printed on it. And yet, even in storms, talent shows up. Gallienus, reigned 253-268, is often overshadowed by disasters, but he understood the new war. He banned senators from army commands to professionalize leadership, leaned on fast cavalry units that could sprint to crises, and began recognizing that the empire's defense needed flexibility more than pride. He fought usurpers with one hand and barbarians with the other, and while he didn't stop the flood, he learned to float. Assassins ended his lesson mid-sentence. Then came a restorer with a hammer in his posture, Aurelian, 270–275. In 5 ferocious years, he put the pieces back. First, he beat the Goths and Juthungi, securing Italy so thoroughly he built the Aurelian Walls around Rome itself, massive brick fortifications that admitted a fact no emperor had said aloud: the capital needed protection in a new age. Then he turned to the map's arguments. In the east, he defeated Zenobia and ended the Palmyrene experiment, parading the queen in golden chains through Rome. Harsh pageantry for a harsh moment. In the west, he took back the Gallic Empire without turning Gaul into charcoal. At home, he tried to steady coinage, organize grain distribution, and give the sun a new place in the city's sky. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, an emblem meant to warm unity that politics couldn't. Aurelian moved like a man soldering a damaged circuit, and the lights brightened. But he died on campaign, stabbed by officers misled by forged accusations. The empire sighed, then shuffled half a dozen rulers across the stage. It took another iron reformer to freeze the chaos: Diocletian. When Diocletian took power in 284, he looked at the old monolith and saw a problem of scale. One emperor riding everywhere couldn't control a world this big or this complicated, so he made a new shape: the Tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 juniors, Caesars, each with zones to manage, all bound by common purpose and regular abdication and succession. It was bureaucracy as architecture, politics as engineering. He reorganized provinces into smaller units, created larger dioceses above them, added layers of officials to watch the watchers. Taxes were standardized, censuses sharpened, requisitions formalized. The army split into frontier troops, limitani, and mobile field forces, comitatenses, because crises had learned to move fast and Rome had to move faster. Price controls tried to stare down inflation. The edict on maximum prices listed everything from a soldier's boots to a basket of grapes. Laws multiplied. Ceremonial did too. Emperors became beings you approached through curtains and ceremony, not men you saw at the forum. The old republican ghosts had long gone. Now the Augustan coyness about monarchy went with them. The state put on a jeweled mask, and behind the mask it kept accounts. Under all this, something quieter had been growing since the 1st century: Christianity. Persecuted sporadically, tolerated locally, it offered communities that crossed class and ethnicity, a story about power that didn't kneel to Mars. In the 3rd century storm, its care networks looked like a second social system, tending the sick, feeding the poor, burying the dead when others feared contagion. To emperors suspicious of any loyalty that wasn't the state's, this looked like a rival. Diocletian's reforms would soon include the sharpest empire-wide persecution yet, 303, an attempt to weld unity by force. Instead, the strike reheated the metal. It's tempting to call the 3rd century a fall. It wasn't. It was a metamorphosis under duress. Rome learning that yesterday's tools couldn't fix today's fractures. The cost was high. Cities shrank. Aristocrats retreated to estates. Civic pride curdled into obligation. And the coin in a worker's hand told more truth about the empire's health than any triumphal inscription. But out of the crisis came a new state, more centralized, more regulated, less sentimental, harder to break. Imagine the empire at dusk in c. 300. On the Danube, a fort commander checks the Annona grain deliveries against tablets because shortages mean mutiny. In Egypt, scribes tally tax in grain and oil, numbers that decide whether legions eat. In Asia Minor, a bishop comforts a family who lost a son to fever and a daughter to conscription. In Rome, the Aurelian Walls catch the evening light, while merchants close shutters earlier than their grandfathers did. The empire is still here, but it speaks with a new accent. The storm did not end Rome. It taught Rome the weather. The next act brings a different kind of solution. One part political genius, one part vision, one part symbol that would outlast emperors' names. A cross lifted over an army and a new capital shining where Europe kisses Asia. At the start of the 4th century, Rome tried to heal by tightening its grip. Diocletian had rebuilt government like a fortress of paperwork and protocol, and when he looked for unity, he looked to the old gods. Loyalty was ritual. Ritual was loyalty. Christians, stubborn in a way the state couldn't file neatly, refused to burn the pinch of incense that said, "Caesar first." In 303, edicts came down like hammers. Churches demolished, scriptures burned, clergy jailed, sacrifices demanded. The Great Persecution arrived not as a single roar, but as a policy that wanted to erase a habit of hope. It didn't work. Some recanted under fear, many did not. Communities organized in the shadows, feeding the poor, tending the sick, burying their dead, writing the names of martyrs into calendars of courage. The state could break bodies. It couldn't reach the part of the story that told people who they were. Then, the map moved again. Diocletian retired, a planned abdication in 305, and his clockwork succession jammed. Rival emperors multiplied. In the West, a young claimant with sharp instincts and a talent for moments stepped forward. Constantine. He had grown up inside the machinery of empire, learned the mathematics of loyalty, and understood the theater of symbols. On the eve of a battle that would decide Rome's western heart, Milvian Bridge, 312, he saw, or believed he saw, a sign, a cross of light, a promise of victory in this sign. Whether it was a vision in the sky, a dream in the night, or a carefully chosen emblem for a new coalition, the result was the same. His troops marched under the Chi. Maxentius fell. The Tiber ran cold around broken armor. With power secured in the West, Constantine did something radical. He made toleration the law. In 313, with Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan. Property restored, persecution ended, worship free. It wasn't a conversion of state overnight. It was the state admitting that force could not decide the soul. But Constantine went further than neutrality. He funded churches, favored bishops in disputes, and made Christianity part of the empire's public language. Crucifixion vanished as punishment. Sunday stepped forward in the week. Bishops found themselves mediators not just of doctrine, but of lawsuits. Faith spread not as a uniform wave, but as a tide with many currents. In cities, Christianity looked like order. Basilicas rising where markets had once been the only crowd pullers, hymns replacing some of the old festival drums. In the countryside, Paganus, the villager, old gods lingered in orchards and crossroads. Conversion worked one household at a time, one patron at a time. Power learned the sign of the cross. Habit kept a shrine in the kitchen a while longer. Empire and church learned each other's shapes by negotiating a crisis of belief. Inside Christianity itself, a question from philosophy class turned into a civil war in sermons. Who is Christ in relation to God? The priest Arius said the Son was divine, but not co-eternal with the Father. There was when he was not. Others, led by Athanasius and allies, insisted the Son was homoousios, of one substance with the Father. Councils were called, tempers warmed. Constantine wanted peace as much as truth, and in 325 he convened bishops at Nicaea. There, after debate and exile and more debate, emerged a creed that tried to hold the center: the Son, true God, from true God, begotten, not made. But doctrine on parchment doesn't end arguments in hearts. For decades, emperors, bishops, and provincial churches wrestled with phrasing and power. Exile became a tool. Restoration, its mirror. Congregations learned that theology could move governors. The empire had wanted unity. It got identity, and identity is noisier. As the state and church braided, another thread joined: monasticism. In the Egyptian desert, Anthony left the city to battle himself and found God in silence and struggle. Others followed him into caves and cells. Soon, Pachomius gathered hermits into communities with rules, a different kind of Roman order, where obedience served humility instead of command. Monasteries became schools of endurance, seed banks of books, later the quiet engines of culture when cities stumbled. Constantine's eye, always on logistics as much as symbols, looked east. Old Rome was crowded with memory and too close to restless frontiers. On the Bosporus, where Europe and Asia stare at each other, he rebuilt Byzantium as a second, then primary, capital, Constantinople, dedicated in 330. Wide streets, forums, a Senate chamber, a palace, and churches growing like thoughts the city would think for 1,000 years. With one decision, Constantine shifted gravity. Trade routes bent, officials moved, the empire gained a hinge. He died in 337, baptized at the end, leaving sons to quarrel over the map he had expanded and the church he had empowered. The 4th century unfolded like a dialogue between old and new. Constantius II favoring Arian positions, bishops convened and reconvened, creed lines drawn and redrawn. A brief countercurrent swept the throne when Julian, later called the Apostate, ruled from 361-363. Educated in Greek classics, fascinated by philosophy, he tried to restore the old cults not with persecution, but with patronage and polish. Temples rehung their garlands. Pagan priests were told to be moral exemplars like bishops. It proved too late. The civic machinery and the hearts of cities had moved on. Julian's early death on a Persian campaign ended the experiment like a candle snuffed by a draft. Christian Rome grew more defined. Under Theodosius I in the 380s, the empire took a decisive step. With the Edict of Thessalonica, 380, Nicene Christianity became the state's official faith. The Council of Constantinople, 381, reaffirmed Nicaea and clarified the Holy Spirit's place in the creed. Pagan temples did not vanish in a day, but their funding dried. Their rituals faded. Their legal standing thinned. In Alexandria, the Serapeum, half shrine, half library, fell to a riot. Elsewhere, altars slept under dust, or under churches built atop their footprints. A world that had once offered many doors to the divine now preferred one. The church, no longer merely a refuge, became a referee. Bishops like Ambrose of Milan confronted emperors with moral claims that no previous age could have imagined. After soldiers under imperial command massacred civilians in Thessalonica, 390, Ambrose barred Theodosius from communion until he performed public penance. Picture it, the ruler of the world standing bareheaded, asking forgiveness in a church packed with eyes. A new kind of power spoke, and an older kind learned to listen, or at least to kneel when the moment required it. While ideas fought in councils, the borders kept their own calendar. pressure on the Danube built like winter clouds. In 376, the Visigoths, driven by Hunnic advances, sought asylum across the river. Corrupt officials starved them, tempers flared, and in 378 at Adrianople, Eastern Emperor Valens rushed into battle and died with much of his army. The shock was more than military, it was psychological. The legions could still win, but they were no longer presumed invincible. Foederati, barbarian allies settled within the empire under treaty, became both necessity and risk, partners in defense, and reminders that Rome now shared its space with peoples it had once kept firmly outside. Administration adapted again. Laws multiplied. The Codex Theodosianus would soon gather them, a dense hedge meant to protect order. Taxes in kind, requisitions for troops, and the paperwork of survival grew heavier. Aristocrats shifted wealth to rural villas, managing estates like private provinces. Cities remained proud, but their shoulders slumped under obligations. Curiales expected to fund public works from their own purses when imperial funds ran thin. The empire could still be magnificent. It could also feel tired. And yet, culture did not dim to gray. Preachers honed a new Latin and Greek that could move hearts. Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa in the East, Jerome, translating scripture into the people's Latin, Augustine in North Africa, writing confessions that sound like a soul learning to speak, and a city of God that told believers where to plant their hope when earthly walls shook. In catacombs and basilicas, in lecture halls and desert caves, the empire learned to think in terms that would outlast its tax codes. Constantinople, meanwhile, glowed. Its hippodrome thundered with chariot factions that were half sports clubs, half political machines. Its harbors bristled with masts, bringing grain from the Black Sea, silk from farther east, oils and wine from the Aegean. Its walls, eventually triple-layered under later emperors, announced a simple truth. The East had the wealth, people, and defensible geography to stay Roman long after the West began to fray. By 395, when Theodosius died, the empire was formally split between his sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. It had been divided administratively before. Now the line hardened. 2 courts, 2 strategies, 1 memory of Rome. The West held ancient prestige and stubborn problems. The East, a stronger treasury, and a city built to shrug off sieges. What had begun as a change in worship had become a change in what Rome was. The empire now moved to the rhythm of bishops and bureaucrats, monasteries, and military manuals. The gods of the Forum were gone. The Forum itself still stood, but its debates often gave way to sermons, its processions to liturgies. The basilica, once a courthouse, became a house of prayer. Empire did not end. It translated. Hold the picture as the century turns. A bishop preaching beneath mosaics of gold. A scribe copying a gospel by lamplight. A general bargaining with Gothic leaders over land and service. A senator on his estate reading Virgil in the morning and Augustine at night. A child in Constantinople who has never seen old Rome and never will, but calls himself Roman anyway. The story has shifted rooms. Next comes the sound of boots in the west and the clatter of keys in the east. The west searching for breath as Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns test its bones. The east reinventing Roman rule under new emperors and older habits. Faith will comfort, complicate, and sometimes inflame. The idea of Rome will survive the city of Rome. But first, the city must fall, and then rise elsewhere. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire's heart split into two beats that no longer synced. In Constantinople, silk roots fed a fat treasury, and sea walls learned how to say no. In Ravenna and Rome, marshes and memory did their best to hold the line. The West had old prestige and new problems. Thin taxes, restless troops, a court that moved like a nervous bird between palaces, and a frontier that behaved like weather. At the center of the early drama stood a soldier with a strategist's patience, Stilicho, half Vandal by blood, all Roman by vocation. As Honorius, a cautious, sheltered emperor, watched from safer rooms, Stilicho juggled crises the way a veteran juggles knives, without looking down. The sharpest blade? Alaric, king of the Visigoths, a commander who knew Rome's strengths and the holes between them. These Goths weren't an invading horde at the gates so much as a nation on the move. Foederati, who wanted pay, land, and respect after decades of serving Roman causes and suffering Roman neglect. Stilicho bought time with treaties and skirmishes, throwing feasts and steel in equal measure. But court politics are hungrier than any frontier. Rivals painted him as a traitor. In 408, Stilicho was executed, and with him went Rome's best chance at balance. Payments to Gothic troops stopped. Massacres of their families triggered fury in the ranks. Alaric marched. In 410, after 3 sieges and a negotiation that kept slipping like a rope in the rain, Rome, the city that taught the world to spell order, was sacked. For 3 days, the Visigoths moved through streets that had believed themselves immune to time. Churches offered pockets of mercy. Discipline kept the sack from becoming a slaughter, but the symbol shattered. Saints would later tell the story as a test of faith. Pagans would blame the new religion for offending old gods. Most Romans simply woke up to a quieter truth. Nothing human is unbreakable. The West still had pieces to play. The general Constantius stabilized the court. Aetius, later called the last of the Romans, rose through hostage years among Huns to become a master of alliances. But while men maneuvered, geography and economics voted, with a majority Rome could not outcount. In 406, under winter ice, Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul, then flowed toward Spain. From there, the Vandals leapt to North Africa, and in 439 took Carthage, the empire's breadbasket and tax jewel. Losing Africa wasn't just a bruise, it was a slow internal bleed. Grain ships ceased to arrive, revenues flickered out, soldiers went unpaid. Loyalty, as ever, followed the ledger. Aetius worked miracles with what remained: federate bargains, careful deployments, a diplomat's smile hiding a mortgaged future. When Attila drove the Huns into Gaul in 451, cities folded or bought breathing room. On the Catalonian plains, Aetius stitched together Romans, Visigoths under Theodoric I, and other allies into a coalition that stopped Attila's advance. It wasn't a clean triumph, it was a saved afternoon. A year later, Attila pressed into Italy. Pope Leo Whiskered met him near the Po. Legend wrapping the meeting in angels, even if the real reasons for retreat were famine, disease, and stretched supply lines. Attila died soon after. The arrow Rome feared most fell to the ground by itself. But victories that keep the roof up don't repair the foundations. Emperors rotated like actors in a touring company no one reviewed kindly. Valentinian III murdered Aetius in 454, killing the one man who could keep the chessboard stable. A year later, Valentinian himself was murdered. The Vandals, now masters of a fleet, sailed into Rome in 455 and sacked it again, this time with maritime efficiency and 2 long weeks of selective theft. They carried off treasures and people, including the Empress Eudoxia and her daughters, a theater of humiliation that Constantinople watched with tight lips and careful letters. From there, the West survived in fragments and careers. The Magister Militum, the commander-in-chief, became the real axis of power, with emperors as lacquer. Names flickered: Avitus, Majorian, a brief, bright attempt at reform, whose fleet burned before it sailed to Africa; Severus, Anthemius, a marriage of Eastern aid and Western need; Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos. Over them all hovered Ricimer, a Germanic power broker who made and unmade emperors, like a man adjusting tools in a drawer. Provinces peeled away into new, persistent realities: Visigoths in Aquitaine and then Hispania, Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, Suebi in northwest Spain, Vandals ruling North Africa and the western Mediterranean sea lanes. In Italy, the army filled with foederati. Barbarian federate troops owed land and pay. One of their leaders, Odoacer, a man with a Roman rank and a post-Roman resume, watched as another boy emperor took the stage. Romulus, nicknamed Augustulus, the Little Augustus. The year was 476. The Western court's finances were thin, the allegiance of soldiers thinner. Odoacer did something both shocking and strangely merciful. He deposed the boy, sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, and asked to govern Italy as patricius, not as a rival emperor, but as Rome's caretaker under a different vocabulary. Contemporaries did not mark 476 with apocalyptic horns. Many didn't notice it at all. Administration continued in Italy. The Senate met. Taxes were collected. Life, always local, remained local. In the provinces, Roman law codes and Latin language persisted under new kings with old Roman advisors. The West didn't so much collapse as translate into Ostrogothic Italy under Theodoric, Visigothic Gaul, and Spain, Vandal Africa. Kingdoms that minted coins with imperial faces and ruled with Roman pens. But the imperial office in the West, its fiction of one unbroken line, was gone. What failed? A sum of small erosions and bad luck baked into big facts. The tax base shrank as estates went private, and Africa was lost. The army professionalized into a patchwork of contracts the state couldn't keep. Politics turned transactional. Great men feared rivals more than enemies. Demography, disease, and migration squeezed borders until agreements replaced walls and then failed one by one. And yet, remember the other half of the equation. The East endured. Constantinople kept grain moving from the Black Sea, kept its walls high and its gold brighter. The idea of Rome moved there with its paperwork, its theology, and its stubborn belief in tomorrow. In the West, the church filled the civic silence. Bishops became negotiators, poor relief officers, judges, and sometimes city fathers in every sense. Monasteries multiplied, pockets where books were copied and routines were saved. A young clerk could still find Cicero and Virgil on a shelf. A bishop could still quote Augustine to a king with a wolf on his banner. The lamp didn't go out. It moved closer to the ground. Picture the evening after 476 in Ravenna. The mosaics don't blink. The marsh smells the same. A notary sharpens his stylus. A woman counts olive jars. A soldier, now Odoacer's soldier, checks the gate. Rome has become a pattern rather than a person. Latin prayers, Roman measures, basilicas over basilicas, roads that still know where they're going. The West has lost the habit of being commanded from Rome. It has not lost Rome's habits. The story of the empire doesn't end here. It changes capitals. Our next step crosses to a city with walls that turn away siege engines and harbors that drink grain like a second Nile. There, emperors will speak Greek and sign Latin laws, argue theology at breakfast and tax exemptions at noon, fight Persians on Tuesday and Bulgars on Friday, and call themselves Roman without a blush. Shift the view east, where the sun hits water and walls before it warms the hills. On the Bosporus, a city learned to be Rome with a different accent. Constantinople, ringed by sea and stone, living proof that geography can be destiny. Here, emperors signed laws in Latin for a while, spoke policy in Greek forever, and treated survival not as luck, but as a craft. Constantinople didn't owe its life to nostalgia. It owed it to walls. The Theodosian walls, layered and moated, turned siege into sport for the patient and misery for the bold. Behind them, harbors packed with grain from the Black Sea and taxes counted with a banker's calm. The city was a hinge, trade from Asia to Europe, diplomacy from steppe to desert, theology from monastery to court. If the West shrank into kingdoms, the East sharpened into a state. Then came a ruler who wanted marble to speak his name for 1,000 years, Justinian, R. 527-565. He didn't rule alone. Theodora, his partner, matched steel to silk, an actress, perhaps a courtesan, certainly a survivor, who could stare down senators and whispers alike. When factional riots, the Nika riots of 532, set the city ablaze, courtiers begged flight. Theodora's answer became legend. Purple makes a fine shroud. They stayed. Belatedly, brutally, the army cleared the hippodrome. Tens of thousands died. The empire stayed put. Out of the smoke, Justinian rebuilt with intent. He ordered a church that would catch the sky, Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, a dome that seems to float on light. Stand under it, and you feel a hush. Mathematics made into prayer. He also rebuilt law. His jurists, Tribonian and colleagues, cut, organized, and restated centuries of statute and commentary into the Corpus Juris Civilis, code, digest, institutes, and later novels. Roman law became Byzantine clarity, the skeleton on which much of Europe would later hang its legal flesh. Justinian wanted Rome's map too. He sent the general Belisarius west with small professional forces and a talent for impossible odds. Vandals fell in Africa with surprising speed, 533-534. Ostrogothic Italy took longer, a grinding war that traded cities and skulls until the peninsula was Roman again, on paper. Victory came with a price. Fields ruined, revenues thin, garrisons expensive. The empire stretched, shone, and strained. Then plague. In the 540s, a sickness, likely bubonic, arrived with rats and grain, curling through ports to palaces, killing laborers and aristocrats alike. Populations crashed, taxes stumbled, armies shrank. The empire that had just tried on old borders found the jacket heavy. A generation sighed and learned to live with fewer neighbors. To the east, a familiar rival changed its face. The Sasanian Persian Empire, centralized, aggressive, surged under Khosrow I. War with Persia was a chess game played across deserts and rivers, fortresses and diplomacy. Some emperors blundered, others gambled. Heraclius, R. 610-641, gambled brilliantly. When Persians captured Jerusalem, 614, and carried off the True Cross, then reached the Aegean while Avars pressed the walls, the empire looked trapped. Heraclius reorganized finance, won church support, and took the war to Persia. Deep marches, winter campaigns, alliances with Turkic peoples. In 627, at Nineveh, he broke Persian power, and the empire reclaimed what it had lost. Crowds wept when the cross returned to Jerusalem. For a breath, destiny smiled. History, however, had been sharpening a new blade. From the Arabian Peninsula, unified under Islam, armies moved with faith and speed. A decade after Heraclius' triumph, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were gone. Fortresses captured, governors replaced, tax systems rewritten under the caliphate. The empire mourned its richest provinces and learned a different survival: contraction with nerve. Out of necessity came the themes: military administrative districts, where soldiers held land in exchange for service. The army adapted from heavy, map-spanning campaigns to resilient regional defense. The state's revenue shifted, so did its posture. In the Aegean, fleets learned new tricks and new fire. Greek fire, a secret incendiary weapon spewed from siphons, turned sea battles into hell for attackers. In 674, 678, and again in 717, 718, when Arab fleets and armies tested Constantinople, the city burned the besiegers back and watched winter and hunger finish the argument. The capital didn't just survive, it demonstrated. But the empire's wars weren't only with enemies outside the walls. Inside churches, an argument over images became a century-long wound. Iconoclasm, the breaking of images, rose in the 8th and 9th centuries as emperors like Leo III and Constantine V condemned veneration of icons as idolatry and ordered their removal. Monks resisted, laity grieved, theology and politics braided into a struggle over who interprets holiness and how authority breathes. The Empress, Irene, late 8th century, helped end the first wave. In 843, the triumph of orthodoxy, icons restored, gave the church its faces back. The state had tried to purify. The people chose to remember. Recovery followed. The Macedonian dynasty, 9th, 11th centuries, presided over a renaissance. Law refined, administration crisp, art and learning rising in mosaics and manuscripts. Photios and then patriarchs of his line pushed scholarship. Cyril and Methodius carried the gospel and an alphabet, Glagolitic, leading to Cyrillic, to Slavic lands, expanding Byzantine cultural gravity beyond its borders. The economy perked. Silk workshops hummed. Gold coins, numismata, shone with a confidence that made merchants smile. In the field, generals like Nikephoros Phocas and John Tzimiskes clawed back territory in Syria and Cilicia. On the Balkans, it took a special will to beat a special rival. Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, ground down the Bulgarian Empire across decades, sealing victory in 1018. The map looked friendlier than it had for centuries. For a moment, the empire felt large again. Underneath, the usual pressures collected tolls. Frontier people shifting, aristocratic families buying up peasant lands, and military service transforming under wealth's gravity. In 1071, a hinge swung the wrong way at Manzikert. Romanos IV met the Seljuk Turks, and the army broke. The loss opened Anatolia, the empire's tax heart, to Turkish settlement and raiding. The blow hurt more than any lost city. It lost depth. The court improvised. The Komnenoi, Alexios I, John II, Manuel III, rebuilt alliances, balanced Venice and Genoa in trade concessions, and turned to Latin Europe for help. Alexios I's appeal helped launch the First Crusade, 1096-1099, a pilgrimage with swords that shocked East and West by actually reaching Jerusalem. For Byzantium, the Crusaders were both opportunity and hazard. They returned seized territory in places, carved out their own states elsewhere, and looked at Constantinople with a mix of awe and appetite. The empire made friends carefully and enemies by accident. Court life glittered, literature bloomed, theology argued, philosophy tugged at old Greek threads. At the same time, treaties, multiplied the fine print of survival. Commerce with Italian maritime powers enriched the city but seeded resentment. Privileges for Venice and later Genoa angered locals and rival traders. In 1182, anti-Latin violence in Constantinople stained memories. Payback would come mean and late. In 1204, the storm arrived from a direction that still feels like betrayal. A crusade diverted, debts to Venice unpaid, politics in Constantinople inviting manipulation. The Fourth Crusade reached the Bosporus, and instead of sailing for Egypt, it sacked Constantinople. Churches were looted, relics pried from shrines, icons hauled west, horses stabled in Hagia Sophia. The empire shattered into shards, Latin Empire in the capital, Byzantine successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, Trebizond. The blow wasn't just military, it was civilizational. The center looted by supposed allies, the trust between Greek East and Latin West broken like a dropped chalice. And yet, stubborn as ever, the Byzantine story refused to end. In 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople for Nicaea, slipping through when Latin defenses blinked. The city he inherited was smaller, poorer, and haunted by empty quarters, but alive. The empire that rose was thinner and cleverer, a state of diplomacy and delay, marriages and treaties, a capital that burned with art while its provinces leaked away. Italian merchants dominated trade. Emperors balanced them like poisons. The Ottomans grew in Anatolia, then Europe. Walls still stood, gold didn't. But that's the next chapter's weather. For now, hold Byzantium at its brightest, a dome floating on morning light, a library copying Aristotle for a future that doesn't know it needs him, a harbor stacked with masts from 3 seas, a palace where courtiers debate law in rooms that smell of wax and incense. Think of a city that turned survival into an art, made theology a language of state, and carried the Roman name across 1,000 years of storms. If Rome in the West taught the world how to build an empire, Constantinople taught it how to endure one. Next, we step into the long twilight and the final blaze, a city that outlived enemies, survived betrayals, and finally faced cannon across a moat. The curtains don't drop quickly. They smolder, and in that glow, the West will borrow books, the East will change masters, and the Roman name will take a last, steady breath.